In conversation tonight we have Elvira Dyangani Ose, who is the curator of international art at Tate Modern, and who previously worked as curator of African art at the Atlantic Center of Modern Art in Las Palmas. She was the guest curator of the Sud Salon Urbain de Douala in 2010 and will be again in 2013, and is currently completing her PhD at Cornell University. And speaking with Elvira is TJ Demos, who teaches in the art history department at UCL and writes on modern contemporary art for publications such as Grey Room, October, and Third Text, Art Forum, and Text zur Kunst. And recent books by TJ include The Migrant Image, The Art and Politics of Documentary During Global Crisis, and Return to the Post-Colony, Spectres of Colonialism in Contemporary Art, and a special edition of Third Text on art and ecology. All of these were published in 2013. So tonight's talk is connected to the exhibition of Issa Samb, which is downstairs in the gallery and also up here, and is more broadly part of a project called Practice International, which is a large-scale European Union-funded research project. So welcome.
Do you want to see? Yep.
You can start with the presentation, maybe I'll just watch.
Okay, yeah.
And then I'll tell you.
We could do that. You leave me alone here. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank, first of all, Grant, TJ, for joining us in this conversation, Tessa Jackson, Daniela, Elva, and all the colleagues here at Iniva. I want to say that, as Grant was mentioning, it's true that this is part of a larger conversation that I have been having with the curator of the show, Koyoko, that, as you know, she's the director of Raw Material Company in Dakar. And also a larger conversation that we had with artist LC and Issa Samb, or let's better say, on their work in at the Tate Modern last November, when we presented a conference, symposium called Experience as Institution. And what I wanted to do in a very formal way is to take you through some of the ideas that we explored that day, but particularly looking at the work of Artist Collective in the continent. And the reason why we decided to think about Artist Collective in the continent and think about the history of Laboratoire Agit'Art in particular was because we wanted to challenge the origin myth of the performance, and particularly how performance refers to the continent. And that has a lot to do with performance in community, ritual, and traditional ritual, if you want, but also the iteration of that rituality in the context of the contemporary. Also has a lot to do with artists that are trying to challenge the limits of the publicness, the limits of the public spheres that have been given, the space they have been given, and they imagine social imaginaries, no? They create these new social imaginaries. So I'm going to try to I just want to say that some of the ideas that I'm going to present today, and hopefully that we are going to discuss later on, have been collected in an essay that is part of my, let's say, an introduction to this issue in my dissertation, and this is collected in Condition Report. Condition Report was the first of the symposium that Koyoko did in Dakar, and at this time, at the time that we are speaking, they're celebrating the second Condition Report on arts educations in Africa. So like, try to follow up on that, because I think it's extremely important to learn both about what is happening in the continent nowadays, but also how art was framed and studied at the time. I'm going to go straight forward to my notes, because otherwise I'm going to be speaking about things that happen around the world. without paying too much attention that what brought us here. And I have to say that there are many reasons why I wanted to work in the first place in the public space of African cities. First of all, because I'm very keen to explore ideas and notions of community and intervention in the public space by artists. I like the way that artists challenge, as I said before, given spaces, given politics, given context, how they trying to transform that. And particularly in African cases, what occurs is that the sense of the public, and we can debate about this later, is completely different at the sense of the public or publicness that we have in the West. Also, I think it's very important to make clear that there are public declarations, statements, manifestos. In fact, what we see downstairs and what somehow frame most of Issa Samb's practice has to do with a philosophical approach. He was a Marxist. He wanted to challenge things. He wants to create a social criticism. He was critical with Senghor and with Senghor's ideas of just taking us for our sake, looking at the westernized model. He wanted to bring something that has to do with the concerns of the community into the art practice and into the work. And I remember a long time ago that I saw this beautiful book, otherwise, that is called Art in Social Change, A Critical Reader. It's a book by After All. And I walked excited to the bookstore and I said to myself, oh yes, I want a copy of this book. And I realized that this assembly of essays on art statement, manifesto, and public declaration, written by artists and writers who, led by the desire of social change, align themselves with wider social movement or break with the established institution of art, didn't contain any whatsoever, not a single one, essay or manifesto of African artists. And that for me was a disappointment, and probably it was my naiveness. But I thought that it was critical to start to look at the way in which artists are considering public space and the way that artists are considering the way that art challenges all these things. No? And I'm not going to try to attend because we don't have time, but also because it would be a long conversation that I don't know if you want to have with me to fill the gap of that communication. But I would like to bring some ideas and some of the case studies that I have been looking at. What I need you to, or what I have to tell you now is that there are, as I said before, artists working in the continent, and of course in the African diaspora as well, that formulate strategies of self-representation, claiming concerns on the name of a community, nation, or in the artist names. And my interest here is to bring also artists and artist collective whose work intervene the everyday experience, emphasizing aspects of the common things, of the extraordinary, questioning the habitual, and formulating new spatial paradigms for social relationship. And in all of this seems to me necessary to tell you that the focus is, or the way that I look at collectiveness or collectivity has a broader sense. I define artist collective as any association of individuals with an artistic and cultural purpose, whether those associations are ephemeral and relate to a specific project, or are permanent and make reference to an organization or a collective structure. And this is something that I explore a lot in my research, in my PhD dissertation. The notion of the collective, the notion of public sphere and community within contemporary urban Africa, while observing how those cultural undertakings, devised by artist collective and artists, use their talents and perception to change the social and urban imaginary. So, one of the things, the ideas that I come across, and I'm not going to refer a lot to the images that you see here. We can perhaps go back to them in the discussion because otherwise we will be here all night, and I'm sure you have other things to do. but I want to use them as a backdrop because another of the aspects that I thought that was interesting, and I'd actually use it as a way of engaging with collectiveness or collectivity in the past, was Jean-François Lyotard's notion of enthusiasm. I don't know if you know, in 1981, Jean-François Lyotard quoted Kant in his critique of judgment, the idea of the enthusiasm as a reflection of the Kantian concept of the sublime, where he, rather than talking about an aesthetic feeling, was talking about a formula that affected not only those participating in an activity, but in an historical event, but also those that observed it from the distance. And I wanted, and I have the feeling that I'm missing one slide that was critical into this, but it's just a larger sort of a zooming of this project, The Inhabitant, in which I think that exactly will happen. Celo Pesa, who is a choreographer from South Africa, worked with a series of communities in the streets of Johannesburg, in the public space of Johannesburg. And when it started as an initiative that only the people in his crew, that only the people from his dance company was taking part of, it became an event that involved many others. No? So in certain ways, the way that artists engage with the notion of the public, the way that the public is at the very center of every event of these artists is really important. There are two largest approaches two major approaches to the subject of my investigation. First is the significance endeavor that not only take place in the early 2000s during that decade, but I like to look at the turn of the century, and that's why something like Laboratoire Agit'Art is extremely important. Because of course it's impossible to conceive contemporary endeavor without examining similar venture that took part during African modernism. And of course we're going to do this jump where now we're going to go to see a little bit of images of where Issa Samb and NLC and other artists were doing in the 70s, 80s and 90s in Dakar. But I wanted to bring in general these ideas about, as I say, how one can observe what are the circumstances that lead this collective production. Some of them I have already mentioned, the criticism to political establishment and also the need to break an urban or architectural space given. And the second is, for me, that is very important, is that all of these events in general happen in the urban space or in the public sphere, accentuating social aspects, intervening in the production of that space, which is what I'm trying to look at in my dissertation, on how then, when artists engage with this kind of experience, they build something that creates an aesthetic of recognition that help the communities to see themselves reflected in those initiatives, and as such, produce something that helps to bring that social change across. These are some images of collectives that unfortunately, like Google Collective, that initiated in Cape Town, that is in a township called Guguletu. And these, unfortunately, this artist collective doesn't exist anymore. But some of the members, here you have another of his projects. I could tell you many things. Actually, the conversation that we have at the Tate, in that conversation, and speak more specifically about the work of Guguletu. So if you want to log into the website, you can see that there. And also you will see the contributions of Simone Yami, that writes in this beautiful essay in the catalog of the Oka, Issa Samb's Oka exhibition, Word. And also Clementine Belize is there, Elizabeth Harney telling us about the art scene in Senegal at the time in which they were creating, but let's say the official narrative of that art scene. So we have, sorry, I don't know if we can can we get the light a little bit darker so then we can see a little bit better the images? They're not super good quality, but I think. No worries. So as I was saying, people like Keman Walarule, that was part of Google Active, is now part of the Center for Historical Reenactment. For those of you that have been in Berlin during the Berlin Biennale, they have a small space where they are presenting some of the ideas. And one of the interesting aspects of the Center for Historical Reenactment is that it's a platform founded by a curator that was initially an artist, Gabriel Kogo, and two artists, Donna Kukama and Keman Walarule. What you will see in the many activities that they do is actually a way of challenging the notion of institution and basically killing the idea of an institution through their practice, bringing more educational or learning projects to the space of exhibition, but also bringing the actions or the sort of the aesthetic of the intervention into the public space of Johannesburg. They're also very close to Hillbrow, that is one of the most radical neighborhoods in the 70s, 80s apartheid era in South Africa, where most of the mixed families that at the time were forbidden lived. So I think it's a very interesting counterpoint of how one can move from a collective to another, because this is something that perhaps we can talk a little bit later. What happened with somebody like Issa Samb that initiated his practice in the 70s as part of this big collective, and then he became this singularized figure that he's bringing this kind of work here, or the work that they did in Documenta, also with Koyo, and this exhibition that I was talking about in Oka. So how one strays, the sort of the collective work, how that collective work somehow fade away into an individual practice. I think this is very interesting. When we can say that the collective finished it, and what is the legacy that the collective has, or the individual artist stay with him when that collective somehow disappeared. So how all these things play in. I think perhaps these are questions that we can ask ourselves a little bit later. So then you have, as I was saying, you have projects during modern, let's say what I call African modernism. We're not going to get there. It's a very large subject. It's extremely interesting. If you are interested, there was a South Atlantic quarterly number dedicated to that was edited by Salah Hassan. I highly recommend it if you are people that are interested in African modernist, the African modernist experience. What I felt was interesting is to bring two things here together with the work of Issa Samb and Laboratoire Agit'Art to talk a little bit about Ngungi wa Thiong'o's initiative in Limuru, Kenya. I don't know if you know anything about it, but Ngungi wa Thiong'o in the 70s, in 1976 to be exact, he was invited by some members of a local community. It was an educational project. And he was invited to help them to produce a play. At the beginning, he was very hesitant. He didn't even understand why he was called. But he just had accepted the role of the dean, I think, if I'm not mistaken now, the director of the Department of Literature in the University in Nairobi. And he has experienced the colonization in second hand, let's say, because he was studying in a board school while that was happening, all the mamas and all the resistance was taking place in Kenya. But he decided to work with this group for 2 years. They put together 2 plays. And the most interesting aspect of their experience is that they integrated the entire community. So even though Ngungi wa Thiong'o and another of his colleagues at the university were leading the project, everybody contributed. It was an incredibly high collective experience. Not only in the sense that everybody was bringing their passion to the rehearsal, but also because people brought their ideas. They did the play in Kikuyu, which was already challenging. They use the idea, the notion of the empty space, instead of using the Italian theater, for instance, bringing back notions of ritual, sort of like traditional ritual, to the understanding of a new theater. A new theater that has a lot to do with Auguste Boal's notion of the theater of the oppressed, for instance, for those people that is interested in this kind of concern in terms of performance and theater. So I think what it was interesting is also how revolutionary it was, so much that it was bound after 2 years, because these were people that were part of the peasantry, all genders, all classes, people from our generation, contributing to the same project, and it was seen as a threat by the authorities. So they did 2 plays, and after that he had to go on exile. Was some years in prison as well. But I thought that was interesting in the context of what then we will find in the case of Laboratoire Agit'Art. To place historically Laboratoire Agit'Art, it was found by Issa Samb and Yusuf, I'm missing the last name, sorry, we will get to it. But it was found as a response, and Koyo wrote beautifully about this also in the larger catalog. As a response to the situation and the official narrative that President Leopold Sédar Senghor was imposing in Senegal. That initiative that was somehow the crystallization, if you want, the materialization of the notions and policies of the negritude, an idea that Leon Damas, Ahmed César, and Senghor wrote about when they were students, and that now, in like 30 years later, in the 60s, when he took off of the office, decided to make into an actual political idea. So that ideology helped to build incredible infrastructures in Dakar, the Teatro Soriano, the Musée de Tapestry, the Musée Dynamique, that holds the first exhibition of Picasso's work, for instance, in Dakar. That also was the venue for the festival in 1966. So in that context, you have these artists that were crazy students already in their 20s that wanted to challenge this limited Westernized vision of culture. And the way that they did in order to challenge that was to, first of all, be extremely rooted in, I don't know if you were here when Issa was talking about his project, but it was extremely revolutionary, has a Marxist background, and also was highly philosophical. The person behind, let's say, the other props and artistic elements of the project was El Haji C. It's slightly younger than Issa, I think he's 6 or 7 years younger. Extremely active still. He was actually was asked to be a curator in 1984 at the Weltkulturelle Museum in Frankfurt, where now Clementine Deley's worked. But he was asked to be a curator there and think about creating a collection of works from Senegal, from their peers, a larger collection, not only about people that was challenging the national narrative, but also people that collide with the ideas of Senghor. So you have people like Papa Igratal, Ivan Diaye, Suleiman Keita, AC, and many others. And I think that was very interesting because one of the aspects that I think is both interesting in the case of Issa and in the case of El Haji C is this sense of impermanence of the artist, right? The art is dissolved, there is no authorship, at least during the time they are working as Laboratoire Agit'Art. What they have is this notion of open source, if we want to say in the current terms, no? Artwork that respond to everybody's concern, that respond to everybody's expectations, that want to reach everybody's ambitions. And you not only have these artists, you have with them, for instance, Clementine Delis became part of the Laboratoire Agit'Art in the 90s, but you have people like filmmaker Djibril Mambeti, you have people like Boubacar Diop, the writer, you have other younger artists like Amadou Kansi, that then later on will open a new art collective called We Facette, in which LC also was part of. And I can't talk forever, sorry about that. I don't know if some of you have been in Dakar and have experienced this space, but it's extremely, it's outstanding. It's what is interesting about it. I don't know if I have a better picture. Must be one somewhere here. Let me just put this one for a moment. This is how like Jules Ferry courtyard where Issa Samb mainly worked, and it has been extremely significant. And one can say that from the late 90s until now, this has been the space that Issa has been working in. What is interesting that every time that they were doing at the Dakar Biennale, he will be changing elements of it, but I could recognize when I went this year, still elements that I saw 10 years ago. And it's about this superposition of these props, because in reality, some of the work that we see here are not actually artwork, are prop for that he creates for a larger project, right? And sometimes it's just the space you get in and inhabit when you enter. It's not necessarily an immersive installation art, right? So I think all these elements in which everyday life and aesthetic and mix are still important in his practice. We have skipped two photos, this one and this one, that for me are really important because Seth Segal, that it wasn't an actual art collective, it was, let's say, a community organization that helped to clean all the city and create these murals to of course, reflect and express political concern, but also in order to challenge the politics at the time. You had to think that late 80s, we have a completely different set of politics. The whole structure that Senghor put together in the 60s disappeared. So people that was engaged in the work that some artists were doing in the late 80s decided to bring, so join forces and get that project together. I think I'm taking a lot of time. Let's try to think about questions that we can have later. One is that how one's engaged with local audience. I think this is something that these contemporary collectives, the same way that Issa Samb and Laboratoire Agit'Art wanted to do, are asking themselves, no? How can one display his or her own identity and that of the community, whether this is the artist's will or not? Can artist discourses establish alternative ways of reading a place or a community? I think this is also another question that some of these artists ask themselves. How can one negotiate with Western and African aesthetic? How can one negotiate with tradition? So in the past, I would say 3 decades, there have been many contemporary initiatives, new cultural platform and artist collective that have been asking themselves those questions, and that have been challenging issues of socio-political, cultural, and historic issues, but also using the city as a paradigm which is setting an innovative new social relation, economic exchange, and cultural undertaking may unfold. And in all these cases, as I was saying at the beginning, the notion of trying to reach a non-art audience or engage with both art and everyday experience is key. As we were saying, also the presence of the audience is at the very core. And as I was saying before, the authorship gets blurred. There is an abolition of the traditional narrative, author versus spectator. And there are two major, there are two important elements that for me define how one can look at this differently, how can make a difference between what is happening in a contemporary moment and what happened in the time of Issa Samb, which are two. One is the importance of the space these artists are intervening, and the informal, the way that these projects intervene both the regulated and the informal city. We're not going to have time because it's 7:15, but I want to show you some images of other projects. The Kalola Besenge, this was a project that 4 international artists put together, and as I say, not necessarily founded as an art collective, an artist collective, but as people that are reflecting on the concern of a community or a collective. And in this case, with the Kalola Besenge, artists Godilei, Jesus Palomino, Artando, and James Becken put together a place for this community to gather. This is a Besenge City project, it was called the project. And the idea was to create a space, a public space, and a radio for the community to express their concerns. I'm going to go through very quickly. One of the key ideas was that the youth will create the programs. They all also have a jingle. Jingle is called? Yeah? When you have that says something like Besenge City, c'est la radio. And that, when that happened, you knew that the program was starting. And it was about to talk about the problems that they have, because this neighborhood was, as you can see, it's almost in a dump area. It is facing one of the main roads leading towards the downtown Douala in Cameroon, but it still was in the outskirts of the city. And they wanted to challenge this sort of like the lack of a public space. And they thought that a radio and a space to gather together as a community will be the ticket. So this is when they are building the space. Here you have the space finalized. Unfortunately, this space only lasts 3 years, but it is another space now in its place, sort of like helping to understand the idea behind the project. Another beautiful thing that happened after that project is that Godilei, the artist Godilei, that was the only one from Cameroon in that group of 4, created a project called Art Bakery. That was also a new platform to support local artists. Unfortunately, Godilei died 2 years ago, and the project continues, but it's not as active as it was. This is also another problem with the collective, but we can talk about the things later. I just wanted to show you also the work of, a slide of a performance that Hobbs and Neustetter did in, Hobbs and Neustetter is a collective in South Africa. God, I can't believe I forget the name of the collective, because it's actually not only Hobbs and Neustetter, but anyway. They have a website that is called On Air, where you can find the work that they have been doing in the past 12 years. Extremely active in the context of Johannesburg. They had been asked by the public council, the mayor of the city, to engage with artists and artist collective to change and put project around Johannesburg. But I brought this piece here because it was a project that they did in Senegal. You can actually access to the video, what they call it post-performance, is in YouTube. If you click and you mention that, you will see it. And I invited them to be part of the project across the board when we did our iteration in Douala. The project was about, we went back to Besenge City. I mean, Besenge City is one of the key projects in my research. And we went back to Besenge City. I sing the song with the community. It was amazing. I always wanted to be a pop star. That's the thing. But what was interesting is that 12 years later, people still remember the story and remember what these artists were trying to do. As I said, the space that they created disappeared. But this is the new public space that they have. They have a new bridge that leads to this public space, and all the areas surrounding this township are now being exchanged. They had light where before they didn't have. They had a water drain system. All of this improvement came after the earlier project that we saw before. And this was one of the performances that we did there with Hobson Newsletter, trying to bring stories. I mean, what you see here were some photos, some images that they took. This was like a fashion runaway, but using fashion as a way of talking about the metamorphosis that the people in the community experience in order to change. So it was like a balance after 10 years to see how much things had changed since the first project that was installed there. The other things that I always like to talk when I present this project, and I'm sorry if you have heard me talking about it in the past, is the work of Ntona Jabe and all the Chimurenga people. Because Chimurenga is a platform that Ntona Jabe, a Cameroonian DJ, a football coach, writer, composer, opened in Cape Town. And as I say here, they launched the issue in 2002. He was invited together with Stacey Hardy, a writer from South Africa that he collaborates often with, to be part of the Documenta 12 in 2007. And they were invited to, together with Glendora Review, in an amazing platform that's supposed to bring together magazines of the world. And they realized that there were only 2 magazines from Africa. And of course, at the time, there were many defunct magazines, but also some existing magazines that nobody knew. And they thought that that was a sign that people perhaps didn't know anything about Africa, or that the knowledge was not accessible. So what they did was to create what they call a Chimurenga library, which didn't aim to be a comprehensive library on all these journals and magazines and ideas. Following the ethos of Chimurenga, the magazine that you saw before is a Pan-African magazine that aimed to reflect on Fela Kuti's ideas around Pan-Africanism, but also bringing together the knowledge of the production of a knowledge of different moments and countries and areas and grounds in Africa and its diaspora. And so you have, as you see before, you have Joe from Ghana, Segame from Ghana as well. Then you have some Moroccan magazine. You also have the South African one, Stiffer, Revenoir from the Parisian diaspora, Third Test, of course. And in some cases, when they thought that the knowledge or the writings of somebody were missing in this ideal library, they will also invite people like Greg Tate, this fabulous composer, musician, writer, electrifying writer. If you have had the opportunity to read his writing, you will know, to be part of the library. When they did that in 2008, they were they were invited by the Cape Africa platform, the second iteration of the Biennale of Cape Town, to reproduce the ideas of the magazine that, as I say, was online in a physical space. And this is what you have here. And basically what they tried to do was to bring together existing and defunct seminal magazine, as I said before, Presence African, Transition, for instance, in the 60s in Uganda, or Black Orpheus that was found in 1957 in Ibadan. The idea is to constitute a platform to disseminate in the universality of the African world and the reinvention of Africans' cultural identities in professional realms, but also in everyday life. And the idea was to gather together all these books. However, what they also did was to create a different perusal in which people will go to, will follow these, what they call it, classifications, which were ways and terms of reference to put together some books, and also create these reading routes with reference to not only the books but larger stories and narrative that help people to walk around the library in a different way. So it was like the ethos of the magazine, but also the ethos of the library. It's not comprehensive. It's It's like using randomness mediated by this classification, as they call it, an opportunity to reimagine the library as a laboratory for extended curiosity, new adventure, critical thinking, daydreaming, sociopolitical involvement, parting, and random perusal. And I think it's so beautiful because it's a way in which you can bring one subjectivity into a collective space. Somehow sort of also mirroring what people like Laboratoire Agit'Art was doing in the 70s and 80s, but also what these 4 international artists tried to do, the Mbesinge City project, or what then the South African collective did in Douala. And these reading routes were everywhere in the space, leading, as I said before, by this classification. You have all these red arrows every single way. Sometimes some of the books were also, the spine of the book was covered or was included with a label that brings further nuance of what one can find in those books. There were special exhibitions, for instance, like this one, which was presented in this way with some pages of books referring to all these concerns. But also they had brought that knowledge out of the setup of the library with this new platform that perhaps you know already, Chimurenga Chronic, in which they invite artists and writers. One of the things, sorry, that before I go to Chronic is that if you go online and you access to the library, you can become a Chimurenga people, because the whole idea of the library was that the library will be nurtured by the knowledge of people around the world that knew the magazines, or that had a specific connection with the magazine, or that knows another story of the magazine, and they will contribute to the website. The contributions vary. They can be from a direct response to that particular magazine, or a video, or a music, or a composition, or a poetry. What it was interesting is that idea of creating sort of like a larger set of sort of like a larger knowledge, and it's for me very interesting how cultural production was defined from this perspective of the subjectivity of an individual that contribute to create this collective narrative. As I was saying, part of that is somehow bequeathed in the Chronic, because what they do in the Chronic is to engage with a specific subject. They produce, I don't know how many Chronic now, because I think they are not as prolific as they were at the beginning. So there must be 4 or 5 already out. Very difficult to find, but there are some places that have them. And it's very interesting because they continue to work with these Chimurenga people, bringing context. What is interesting is that not necessarily they're reflecting something like the current state of affairs, but they also invite people that create readings that use reality and fiction together in order to engage with a specific sociopolitical issue. That also reminds me, I don't have a slide here, but of another collective that it will be very interesting for you is the Kenyan collective called Kwani, who is led by Binyavanga Wainaina, the writer. It's an exceptional group. And what is interesting about Kwani is that it's a printed platform in which, again, you can collect poetry, you can collect comics, reference to current state of affairs is also news, but also novels and short stories go there. And the Chronic is also, the Kwani magazine is also the excuse to make annual poetry festivals and concerts. So it's extremely interesting. There are so many things happening in so many places that I don't know where to start. So I brought you some other images of the work of artists in Douala. Douala, l'Espace Douala, and the association, the Cultural Association Douala is one of the pioneering ones in the continent. They have been on since 1991, run by Didier Shaw and Marilyn Doualabel. And they were, in 2003, they already collaborated with communities like the one in Besenge. And in 2000, after the Besenge City project, they supported some local artists to continue with the radio for a while. Since 2007, they had started the Salon Urbain de Douala, that is specific interventions in the public space of the city. You have here some of them. This is a garden that what they do in general is to invite international artists and local artists to work with communities. So they do a residency. We did the same with, for instance, when we invite, we collaborate for the project with Stephen Hoffs and Marco Neustetter. And they, as all the artists there, live with the community for a while and respond with an art piece to what the community needed. And this is one of the most special work that had come out of that experience. But this is very simple. How do you call this? Yeah, there are screens to, for instance, to protect the intimacy of the men that sometimes go and take a bath in the river. They usually had to wait until it's really, really dark to do it, and now, because of they do it. There are also other interesting projects like Picha Rencontres. That was a biennale that put together a collective of artists, photographers, writers, musicians that together opened a space called Picha in Lubumbashi. I had the immense pleasure to work with them for one of the editions of the biennale. And the idea of the project that they had done, it looks very humble, but they intervened the space of the city of Lubumbashi with photographies. This was not the edition that I did. With the edition that I did, we didn't have any money to do anything at all. So we did a lot of things, but less in the public space that I would have loved, but it was nonetheless an amazing experience. And they do photography, but also projections in the public space. And I think I'm going to end with that because that is the end of the PowerPoint. Let me see if I can go back to the beginning. Just to, so then we get a little bit of light. Just to recap in a way, if you want. For me, one of the interesting aspects that both Laboratoire Agit'Art and this other platform have in common is this idea of creating strategies for self-representation and recognition. As I said before, what are the artists doing to challenge the production of knowledge of a specific territory, how you frame that without being framed or imposing a representation to a community. We had conversation, I think, since post-colonial times about, who has the right to talk on behalf of who, no? And all this experience challenged that by two things. Now, first of all, blurring the difference between the spectator and the author, and second of all, but bringing a different understanding of publicness. No? So I think that is also very important. But what I think for me is a challenge as a scholar and also as a curator is how to represent those projects when one of the aspects that define it is this ability of the actors within those projects to live simultaneously multiple temporalities. How you bring that to the conversation. One of the things that I thought that was very interesting about working, for instance, both Clementine Delis, that is now preparing a work on the practice of LC, or Koyo, that has been working a lot with Issa Samb to bring the character of Laboratoire Agit'Art, in the sense you remember those images of the courtyard. We can perhaps leave that on the screen. How one's work in a space that is a white cube to keep the intensity and the value of these sort of the randomness of a space like the Rue Jules Ferry courtyard. And I think that is also very important when we talk about representing this collective. There was one other reason why I wanted to do the project of experience of institution at the Tate, and it's really difficult to sort of like bring that, bring that notion to a setting that it has to be more didactic. It was the fact that I believe all these structures are challenging the way in which Western present the notion of institution. So can we think about a moment, an experience, something that happens, something that perhaps doesn't has a legacy as such, something that doesn't last as an institution? Can that hold everything else that we confer to an institution? And I think with that question, I'm gonna leave it there and we can start our conversation. Thank you. Sorry, I talked too much.
Thanks very much, Elvira. That was really a fascinating introduction to all of these practices and the various concerns that you're developing in your work, which is really amazing. I learned a lot just from that presentation. So, I don't know, how much time should we take to do a conversation right now?
20 minutes. But we can invite also the public to be part of that. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
I don't know where to begin there because there were so many questions. But maybe we can come back to Issa's work and the exhibition here in relationship to his collective practice in the past. And I have an interesting quote from his book of writings that's also just come out by Sternberg Press, which is really helpful to me as a teacher, as someone who would teach this material. But in the past, I've found that I haven't found so much information on Laboratoire, and so it's by now there's a lot out there that would be very helpful. But he wrote this. At some point, I'm not sure, there's no date, but maybe in the 90s at some point. It's an essay called A Critique of Representativeness in the book Word, Word, Word. That's on sale downstairs, actually, the Sternberg Press book of writings. And in that short essay, he writes at one point, we must put an end to a commonplace, that concern with the representativeness of a race, of an art, which belongs by right to inevitably sectarian party members. So I'm curious how you think of his practice, because I think you can see, in a way, just the total disarticulation of visual and textual language that he brings about in his work in situ in Dakar, as well as in the exhibition downstairs. And how does that come together with what you're trying to emphasize, which is the phrase that you were using, the aesthetic of recognition. So if he's critical of the representativeness, how could that figure into an aesthetic of recognition?
Well, that's a great question. Just to frame that particular piece that I think also was part of the catalog, the Whitechapel 7 Stories about Modern Art in Africa, which means that it was one of the manifestos that are in that book that refer to the 70s in Dakar, and also other manifestos that were there that are talking particularly. There was something that I think is important in the sense of representativeness that he's talking about. No? And actually, one of the things that I also try to engage with in my dissertation is, and in my research in general, is how one can create something that represents a community. And whether if we are talking about enthusiasm as as this sublime experience that connects us to a historical event, not only because we are looking at it, but because that drove us to participate. How then one can refer to the enthusiasm as in the same attempt to reflect on the national culture, for instance, or to the context of a community. And I think the way that he uses to do that is the experience, right? The objects that we see, that is figurative or abstract, are not responding directly to a notion of what one could call representation or national representation or community representation. In a way, it is as subjective as the work of Chimurenga, for instance, in which the subjectivities are included there. So it's like what he is responding to at that very moment is to what was happening in the National Theatre, to what was happening in the Museum of Tapestry, or also in the Musée Dynamique, where all of a sudden a Western understanding of the art was unfolding. And he thinks that is art for the art's sake, but is not looking at the concern of local communities. What they are looking at, they're saying, we don't want that kind of representation. We want something that the community can connect with. If one thinks about the traditional rituals, right? You, as an African, sort of like growing up in a community, well, it happened also in the West, to be honest, in fairness. Because when you are born in a family, you don't decide what family you're born. You are born in a set of principles, in customs and ideas. You grow up within that. That also make you connect with things that happen in that family in a specific way. Rituals work that way. Somehow traditional ritual are something that which people engage with since an early age. You are not even conscious that you are engaging with that. When Western form of or understanding of art, or the imposition to certain definition of what African art was, tribal, traditional, etc., or Negro art, were imposed to the art of artists like not only the ones in Laboratoire Agit'Art, but also earlier artists from earlier periods like Benebumbu and others. They say, well, we want to engage with our own culture, in which representation was something else. It wasn't about mirroring a world through an artistic experience or an aesthetic experience. Was more about living that experience together. Was experiencing. I would say. So what Issa is trying to do, I don't know how much of that is reflected in the current work, I had to say. I think it is represented in the sense that it's a legacy of the visuality of his earlier practice. But initially, as I said before, the work that he did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it wasn't necessarily looking at these pieces as artwork, which I think sometimes when we see the work downstairs or we see the work in other exhibitions, the white cube with his own definitions of what it is put into that context transform the sense of prop that one doesn't have when visit the space in Jules Ferrer. So you could be sitting in one of these stones that is like actually considered part of the props, but you will be sitting there because you cannot differentiate the stone from the flags that are hanging. And not having a differentiation between the two is actually the sense of the work. Experiencing the work as you inhabit it, the way you want it, is actually what you have in your favor. Something that here it won't happen, right? There will be moments where you enter to that space and feel like you are in a sort of like altar or something like that, like something of a religious kind. You cannot touch certain things, but you won't do it because of the non-touch in the arts. You won't do it because you will respect that this is there. It doesn't seem you can touch it. But there are many elements that for him were absolutely crucial in the space that you can actually use, touch, engage with. That I think is different when you bring the work here.
Yeah, so the context is crucial to how the work operates. And I'm thinking also it's significant for how, we might define the aims and objectives of collectives. Because as
Yeah.
you're pointing out, for the laboratory, in the, when it was forming in the 70s and coming into being during that time, it was, operating very much in opposition to the Senghorian
Yeah.
official culture of a new kind of post-colonial recognition, in a way. So in some sense, we might talk about Issa's work as a kind of aesthetic of disrecognition or misrecognition, to escape from those cultural official categories. Whereas some of the other collectives that you're talking about, like in the DRC, for example, where there are no or very few official institutions, especially within the cultural realm, maybe the imperatives are completely different, and it's not so much an aesthetic of disrecognition, but the significance of community building, as you're talking about, and creating something that could be a sociability of recognition. That would be a complete, very important in a way that for Issa wasn't.
Well, I mean, the thing is that, and he talks a little bit about that when he was here. He was trying to challenge these notions of art for art's sake, because he thought that the community was distant to that. Like, all of a sudden, he wanted to create a social criticism. The only way to do that is to do a work that the people will feel recognized to. Doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to, he's not presenting a figurative image in which you see yourself reflected. It's about something else. And ritual has a lot to do with that, no? And I think, as you were pointing out, in the case of Issa and LC and others in Laboratoire Agit'Art, they had to challenge a contest that is given where a cultural, an actual cultural policy exists. In the case of Congo, for instance, as you said, they are building that culture from scratch. Yeah. Doesn't mean that, like in the 50s, they were an amazing culture. In the 60s, they were also fantastic. But there were things that had been disrupted, and government that is not paying too much attention to what artists can do there. The culture is led by international institutions. So they felt that they didn't have a local ground that they can intervene with. They need to create something from scratch. They need to go back to the pioneers, photographers or writers or musicians, to bring that knowledge to the present and use that platform to engage people with something that was there. And in that sense, somehow connect with Laboratoire Agit'Art, because what Issa and others are doing at the time is to go back. I mean, they cannot go back completely, fully blinded to the pre-colonial Africa, if you want. But they think that there are values in that pre-colonial notion of Africa. There are values in the new understanding of social Marxist that they can adapt in order to be more connected to the present, in order to create a more revolutionary take on the present.
Absolutely, and that again shows in the work, and just the significance of the montage structure, and just the heterogeneous materiality to build exactly that kind of that kind of identity or non-identity, or some kind of way of being that's not forced into any kind of essentialized identity position. Is again completely different in some ways to the Senghorian model of negritude, right?
And actually completely different to all sort of, like, let's say, national narrative at the time. In the 60s you have, so the government had to, like, the role of artists and intellectual was pivotal, right? 50s, 60s, the countries are in transition, some of them are becoming independent, and they had to define on their own what is going to be the politics, the cultural policies, the way that they're going to engage with the economy, how they're going to deal with other countries in Africa and elsewhere. All of a sudden, I mean, Senghor is something that was absolutely relevant nonetheless, no? Even if the aesthetic wasn't much appreciated by the locals. Because one of the things that, for instance, Elizabeth Harnett talks about in her book in Senghor's Shadows, is how conflicted with the position of people like LC and Issa Samb, no? Because they were against this, the Dakar Art School that was basically following the program, or the educational program of the École de Paris, the Paris Fine Art School. And they were saying, well, we want to do something that has to do with us. In order to do that, they did this theater display, that was using one of Senghor's poems on Chacan and in the former African warriors, right? So it's like they somehow hated what Senghor was doing on the one hand, but acknowledge, you know, the extreme-rich knowledge that it provides as well, no? And transform that into experience of a play that then used all these elements here. Sorry.
No, that's.
I always take a lot of risk.
It's great. I thought we might also, because Clémentine Delis has come up a few times, and she wrote an essay in After All on the.
It's coming out now.
It's coming out now. Okay, it's not out yet.
Yeah. We are like a pioneers of this.
Can I read a passage from it?
Yeah, of course you can.
And then maybe we could talk about the exhibition a little bit more.
Yeah.
But before, I had a thought on what you were just saying. In relationship to this period of the 60s and 70s and that post-colonial moment of where many nations were experiencing the imperative of how to create a new kind of identity after the colonial period. And in the exhibition, there's a beautiful moment of this when in a video where Issa is shown dancing, and there's names of politicians that are running across the video, and Mobutu comes up at one point. And it was just a very funny and in some ways poignant and political juxtaposition between just this whimsical act of bodily movement, dancing down the road, and Mobutu comes up, the Congolese dictator from the 60s, who was very much about one model of Africanization.
Yeah.
But in this essay, Delis writes at one point something that is quite critical of Issa's abandonment of the collective identity that I think is quite interesting to think about in relationship to the show, even though we might not feel like we have to accept everything that she's saying. She writes, if the state of the courtyard over the last 40 years can be viewed as the developmental site of Samb's Gesamtkunstwerk, then the recent transposition of some of the objects into a gallery situation has effectively ruptured this extended time-based work and its subtle alchemical decomposition. His recent solo exhibitions at several places, for example, the Office for Contemporary Art in Oslo in 2013, have proved divisive within the collective. Several works extricated from the courtyard and exhibited under his name were effectively the results of group performances by the Laboratoire Agit'Art or productions from other workshops that were stored in the yard. Rather than include his colleagues in this recent recontextualization, Issa Samb has chosen to omit their presence and pursue a new solo career as a visual artist. This is not to imply that Samb has not always been an artist, but that his aesthetic behavior and his dialogical and political engagement have today veered toward a new field of an individualized object production and commercialization, which works in part to blot out his former brothers in arms. That was pretty...
And that's the end.
Yeah. Very,
I mean, it's very bold, and I think in a way, as we were sort of like pointing out before, it makes sense. I mean, I think I would like to see how this holds when she works on LC's exhibition that is going to open next year in March. I think this is a very critical statement that it needs to have a space and a reflection. I don't think, and this is also, Grant, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember having this conversation with Issa where he feels that he's taking some of the ideas that he knows are collective, but not necessarily to bring them as his individual practice. He's thinking this is a knowledge that we all share, and as we share it together, we can also spread it out individually. And I don't think it's the choice of the artist to exclude everybody else. I think it's clearly, since he had started to collaborate with Koyo, he had put that sort of like the response to what the market is hoping for when one's work with the individual artists, sort of like the object, the thing that now becomes collectible because it becomes a commodity, I say. And that is a critical aspect if we think about this as part of that legacy. Is that's one of the questions that I launched before, no? Like, how can one think about the history of Laboratoire Agit'Art now that individual artists from that moment are bringing the practices as an individual. I was thinking, for instance, Keman Walarule, this artist from South Africa, is a very young artist currently in the Berlin Biennale, also part of the Center for Historical Reenactment and former member of the Google Collective.
Which you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so some of the work he's doing now, of course, it's individual, and sometimes they did individual work when they work together in the space of Google Etu. But some of the things that he was doing at the time were part of this collective experience. Now he's doing it as individual. It was very clear for the members of the Google Collective and for him that some part of what he was presenting within the collective was his own practice. And I don't know if you noticed it, but when I had mentioned some of the elements in the Google Collective slides, I have mentioned a couple of names because they were the people working on that specific installation. In that case, was really clear. What happened with Laboratoire Agit'Art is that for them, the entire experience was collective. Everything that they produced was collective. And the problem is not so much that he is bringing something as individual. I will see more sort of like my concern will be what happened when what we are presenting, as an artwork was conceived as a prop for a performance. When it wasn't even an artwork, it wasn't something that you can collect and name and title. It was just something in the space. Right? That for me will be the question more than there is like now is an object that I made, because there is a sense of authorship. He also made this work. He had the total right to present this work if he wants, as anybody else could claim them, right? I don't think he's challenging the brother in art. I think what concerned me most is what happened now. Like we are commodifying a practice that was essentially part of experience more than an object of art to admire and to engage with from a distance. Yeah.
I think it's an interesting point that she's making, but also I wonder if it's not a little problematic for the reason that the essay is very much celebrating the experimental aspect of the laboratory and the fact that this was about, in some ways disidentification and refusing to be any one thing. But then when it comes to his opportunity to do something else from the collective experience, then suddenly, he's reprimanded for this because, it doesn't fit into what he's supposed to be. So it's a little bit of a difficult situation.
I think in this case is that, and I think that is timing, right? Like when in 5 year time, when LC has done his show and will be recognized for that moment, for his practice, for what he did as a curator in the 80s, for his role in 7 Stories about modern art in Africa, etc. That won't be a problem, you will see, right? Like I'm now thinking in the future. Because why? What happened is that there is a sense of, what they say in French, restitution, right? That they think that it needs to happen, a historical one, right? Because there has been a twisted, I don't think has nothing to do with Issa, and perhaps has slightly less to do with Koyo, but probably she could be sort of like responsible in a way, if you want, of not challenging too much the way that people have framed the work of Issa individually. But I think she has said and sort of over and over again that he was never intended to represent the entire collective. And I think this is what saved them from that statement.
And the show isn't built that way.
Exactly.
Either, so.
The show isn't built that way. The presentation in Documenta wasn't built that way. The show in Oslo wasn't built that way. And actually the space, which is extremely emblematic, has been intervened by Issa only for a long, long time, for the past, I would say, 10 years. LC and the others just go there, pass around, but they haven't been interactive as they used to do in the 90s. So why one should blame them? Because I think one can say that after 7 Stories about modern art, the collective receives 1 or 2 more years. But after that initiative, it was gone. Because there was so much tension and so much imposed criticism from outside that then defined the way that the members of the collective wanted to operate after the show, that they basically disappear. And because nobody has said this is done, it's over, we close the collective, that feeling that somebody's dragging from the legacy to the collective to become an individual artist in their own right, is criticized. But I think that the key point here is to say, well, we should ask ourselves when the collective ended and when the practice of the individual started.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
I think that this is on. I think that's what's interesting is I mean, of course, the thing of bringing the work from the atelier in Dakar to any other space is really complicated, and it's an experiment, and it's hard to say if it's successful or not. But I think maybe the thing about Clementine's statement is it's a kind of very hard formulation of something which, from my conversations with Koyo and Issa, for what they were, seems to be a much more ambiguous thing. I mean, on the one hand, though, Issa was very precise in the sense that he always said that he was nothing to do with this. I mean, maybe that's disingenuous, but he would constantly say, you know, you can take what you want, you can put it where you want. I'm not curating this. I'm not taking responsibility for the movement of the work from there to here. So maybe there's something there which he's rather conscious of. But the other thing that I found was that I could never really get a very, and perhaps it was a kind of language thing, but I could never get a very clear account of when did Laboratoire end, who was still there. You know, when I asked, when I tried to ask Issa about this in Dakar, he said, well, they're all still here, you know, the clothes are here, there are shirts hanging up, that belonged to this person, that belonged to that person. So I think it's actually very, and maybe it goes back to what you say about the record, you know, this kind of very hard record of things. How can that happen in relation, not only how can the work be transposed to another gallery somewhere else, but how can that record be made? Because it's very complex, actually, this situation, and the relationship between Issa and the collective.
I mean, I think there will be a point, as I say, like a turning point is going to be this new show of LC. One of the things that Clementine also talks about in the article that you will soon read in After All is that Issa was in charge of the philosophical and the more sort of like the manifesto and the most performatic activity probably, and LC was in charge of the visual. But again, saying that is also betraying the sense that everything was from everybody, that everything was part of the collective experience. That's why I say, you know, once you have this other show in place, one there is recognition and people see what he was capable of, etc., there will be no problem. I assure you.
But something else that comes out in the article that's I was really fascinated by is the history of the collective's interest in psychiatry and specifically anti-psychiatry in Dakar in the 80s when they were doing experimental workshops in a clinic in Dakar and experimenting with workshops that were called things like the teaching of deviance and premature deviance and loss of consciousness. And I think that, in a way, expresses the commitment to this irrational creativity that Issa, demonstrates in his work, and that goes back to the beginnings of the collective. And maybe that embrace of that irrationality and that creativity and that sense of perpetual becoming and disidentification and re-identification, it just doesn't lend itself to these kind of borders and rules and timelines and frameworks that we curators and art historians might want to impose on it to make it intelligible, and maybe that's an interesting conflict to recognize.
I mean, I think that's also the key question, no? Like for and I know that Koyo had asked that herself when preparing the show, and as you were describing beautifully, you get there and he said, take everything you want. And that also obeys to the fact that he's inviting you to be part of this collective experience of collectiveness. No, you are as much as a member of Laboratoire as you contributing to this. The problem is that then the sort of like the intelligibility of this, like the way that it's read here when you had the work here, is like Issa Samb is the work had made the work, and then Koyo had made the curatorialship. So I think there is a part of that. No? The other aspect that I think is interesting for what you were saying about the how they want to intervene with psychiatrists, with irrational thinking, with revolution, with something that it seems that has no place in the everyday experience. It's fascinating. No? And NLC will explore that as well. He had a commission in a hospital, and he will produce work for the different areas of the hospital, no? Partly in collaboration with Laboratoire Agit'Art, but also on his own. I mean, I think and that was always an issue when we were trying to do sort of like to talk about this history at the Tate. Of course, all this conflict came alive, and I said, for me, what is interesting is to tell the story of this group. What is fundamental is to understand that this is extremely important for the history of art in Africa, but also that can tell us something extremely different about performance in general. So it's like, you know, of course there are groups that work with psychiatrists' experience, with irrationality, with this sense of impermanence, but nobody had studied that in the context of the continent. And I think that is fundamental. Of course, there is a lot of criticism, people that's street theater and things like that, but nobody had talked about the way in which collective like Laboratoire Agit'Art challenge a sort of like a very established internationally, if you want, cultural policy like the one established by Senghor. I think that is the main focus here. No? It's like I take all these conversations, as I say, in 5 years nobody will remember, because we will have more and more things nurtured in the story to make it clearer, to make it more accessible in their own right. And I think this is what we need to aim for.
Well, I very much look forward to your dissertation or
Me too.
or forthcoming book project, because I think, as you said, the Art and Social Change catalog that was put out by
After all and
Van
yeah.
Abbe and Charles Esche,
yeah,
Van
yeah.
Abbe Museum is that's amazing that there was nothing included on Africa at all. That's really incredible. So it makes your work all the more important, and I think it's absolutely fascinating. Maybe we should have questions if there are any.
It's okay, you can leave without question.
Yeah.
Elvira, it's rather separate from what we've just been talking about, and it's not necessarily linked to Issa Samb, but I was interested in what you said early on that came out of the Laboratoire and other collectives of the impermanence of the artist. And I kind of contrast that with a number of solo working artists where there's a very, very acute sense of their own history because they were under siege politically in a number of ways. An example would be Peter Clark. And I'm just interested to hear more around your thinking of and the manifestation of that impermanence.
I mean, I think that's a great point. Perhaps one of the most interesting things that comes with African modernism is artist individuality, right? Like traditional art, and before the encounter with the European, traditional art in general was a tool to express a community's ideas, to represent communities' stories, concerns, etc. When the aura of the modern artists came with all the educational world, etc., you have these other artists. You have people like Benevumbu that are talking highly about how they challenge the Western notions of art, the way that West impose a canon to the African art, and the way that they want to limit in many senses. And this is like in the 50s, he's writing this fabulous essay, The Problem of the African Artist Today, you know? In 56 in a conference in Paris. There are incredible artists that are not only, I don't think, well, I mean, there are many artists that they do art for the art's sake, for sure. But artists like Peter Clark are talking about, that is behind his work, for instance, I see a collective voice within sort of like the parameters of a subjective narrative, if you want, but it's a collective voice nonetheless. He's representing a community of people in South Africa. He's also bringing narrative or silence stories into the larger, sort of like the larger narrative or system of the system of art. No? Google Active, you had the same thing. For me, what I think when I talk about impermanence, I talk about this notion of authorship that is so much present in that initial individuality of the artist that come across in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But doesn't mean that the artist at that very time is not engaging with larger stories, something that is larger than them individually. I think even when they are bringing that subjectivity with them, they are talking about collective memory, they are engaging with something that is, as I say, larger than them. And yeah, I don't know if this responds to your question. But I think, I don't as I say, I define collectivity or collectiveness sometimes also looking at the way that an individual artist is contributing to bring with, you know, his or her perception and understanding of what is happening, you know, elsewhere or with the community. That for me is the key. I don't think it just shows the fact that he is an individual artist. I mean, there is something beautiful that. Sorry, I'm so tired, I'm forgetting things. There was a festival in Botswana in the 80s where Tammy Mayele, the artist, South African artist in exile in Botswana, he developed this notion of cultural worker, right? As how the artists were trying to escape of the sort of like the commodification and the bourgeois notion of art and artists to become this representative of a group or a society, a community, a nation, etc. And that for me is the key. Like I see this cultural worker as part of this collective experience. Right? He's as much as a collective as a group of people that gather together and say, we are going to defend this aesthetics. So when we talk about Issa Samb doing an individual practice or LC doing an individual practice, are we really talking of them as individual, or they are really bringing with them all that knowledge, all that sort of like caring, all that storytelling, all that challenging history through those works?
I think, I mean, just to continue from that point, I think that for me, the thing with Issa Samb in terms of the collective and the individual is, I don't recognize maybe so much this commodification. Of course, you know, because of the kinds of places these works are being shown, or these props are being shown. But there's definitely this sort of myth of the kind of iconic figure of Samb, which is built up through this process. And that seems to me to be something more problematic actually than maybe the fact that I don't even know if there's a market for this work, or whether it is being collected, or is it? I mean, is it?
I don't think it's being collected yet, but it's presented as collectible now.
Yeah, I guess it's the process towards that. Yeah.
I tell you, 5 years.
Yeah.
Give it 5 years. Yeah. But I don't know. I mean, well, I mean, if we think that this is a little Damien Hirst or an older Damien Hirst around, and is this figure of the artist, you could say yes. You know, I don't like those figures either. But the emblematic, so what is emblematic about Issa Samb is, it could be emblematic of many other, like he will be like Jos Undur, right? Yeah. The only thing is that we have no access to Jos Undur, but it's the same thing in Dakar. Right? It's like, I don't know how much is the art world as it is that he's a prominent figure, socially speaking, in that context. Yeah. We bring it this sort of like a status through the art world. Yeah. I don't think the art world had made Issa who he is. He had gained that right just doing these things in Dakar. Yeah.
That's clear when you're there. You can really feel his presence very strongly.
So that's what I mean. He's not
this that's producing that.
He's not an artist. He's not a Damien Hirst made by the art system.
That's for sure.
But you know what I mean? It's like, it's not that kind of thing. And even that sometimes it can be like, let's say difficult, for lack of a better term. Yeah. But it's like, he's not that kind of thing. It has to do with the car. It has to do with
No,
what
it's
it
very
means to be a
grounded.
papa in the car. No, it's like you're the dad of a lot of people, right? And you have that status, and you show it around. You're a chief.
Yeah.
And in those things, like, it's extremely traditional, very patriarchal.
Okay, I don't know. Shall we? I think that's. Do you have a question? Is there somebody there who's? Yes.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I just wanted to ask about the relationship between people and the public space within the built urban environments. It's something I'm really interested in terms of building community projects and how people really interact with their public spaces to actually make interventions and change the space in some way. And I just wondered, in your work, what maybe were some of the most really exciting or interesting perspectives and reactions and responses where people have been really fully engaged in those interventions and really really fully engaged in transforming their spaces.
That's a great question, but I don't know where to begin because, as I say, when you enter in the Jules Ferret, for instance, nowadays even, it feels like this temple, strange place. Everybody walks almost in silence. But then there are moments where it's like, super engaging, and you almost can have a party there. When that happened in the public space, it's extremely successful. That's what happened. You know, like, what is the name of this playwright, Peter? I have it in my head.
From where?
I don't remember where is he from. It's a theater theorist that invented the notion of empty space for the West, because the empty space existed in traditional culture for a long, long time. I don't remember. Anyhow, what is interesting? Peter Brook, yeah, thank you. Thank you. So what if one thinks about that, one can also think about Augusto Boal, Theater of the Oppressor, right? The space or the street theater in the 50s in Nigeria was like that use of the space that sometimes is like the space of demonstration, sort of like the temporary intervention, the claim of that space. But some other time, as we saw with Seth Sedal, or as we have seen, well, we didn't see it, but I can tell you about, for instance, the work that Manche and some other artists and musicians are doing with something called Shalawote Festival in Accra, where they go to this place, Jamestown, or what Godilei and then the other artists did in Besenge City Project. All those things had changed the actual physical urban space where they have been operating. Personally, I would say, because I couldn't choose, like, for instance, the work of Stephen Hoff and Marcus Neustetter in Dakar was extremely beautiful. That was a conversation over 3 years with Senegalese communities, Senegalese individuals from communities living in Johannesburg, that were telling the artists how to draw a map of Dakar and how to go around Dakar with the memory of Dakar, no? Like people that were living in Johannesburg for the past 5 to 10 years, so they haven't returned to Dakar, and they were telling them, you know, drawing the maps to sort of move around the city of Dakar. And the first conversation with Dakar for them happened in the context of their conversations in Hillbrook with these Senegalese communities. They went back to Dakar, they start to sort of like leave the city through these maps, which were crazy. I mean, this is beautiful. If you want, you can check online. For me, it's one of the most engaging projects that I have seen of this collective. And all of a sudden, the city is not anymore the colonial sort of map, is not anymore what the different government had built after the 60s. It's this crazy space, subjective space, that has corner that doesn't respond to a street specifically, but a tree or a store or a legend or a story that somebody told in a specific place. And this is the way you move. And if you go to Dakar nowadays and you don't know Wolof, and you only have like a very fancy degree in French, it will be very tricky for you to get yourself around Dakar at some points, because the taxi drivers know Wolof, and they think about the city through this experience as well. So you will have to go to, for instance, from your hotel to raw material, and then you had to tell that you had to go to the hospital, to the street B, but then when this person and this other person had this little shop, you turn right here. And for me, that's sort of like, that narrative of the city is extremely, extremely important. That is what defines public space in a way. It doesn't matter what the urban map says. This is the way that they live the city, and it's the way that you can only experience the city if you talk to them. So for me, this is a very engaging project. The same way that they did, for instance, like a very personal take on this would be the Besenga City project. No, I was very good friend of Godile. I admire the project that they did with the Besenga City project. I think it was one of the most interesting initiatives that took place in Douala. And for me, it was a pleasure to go back years later. I was there in 2010 and now in 2013, and see how the people had transformed the space, and now where there was just a lamp and they have this street, very narrow, but they have street. Now they have a small little square in between houses, when before it was just a dump of water and there was nothing else. I mean, all these things make community, and some of the artists that were there that participated in the project are now became like established artists as well. So all this experience for me is extremely engaging.
Thank you. And are there just certain key principles that you find running under the most successful ones, perhaps?
Sorry, say again?
Are there certain key principles behind these things?
Actually, I think the principles are the negative ones. Like what probably connect all this experience together is at some point they fade away, right? Like, I'm not interested in the permanence of this experience. Like, I don't want to institutionalize it. Of course, I would like for some of the spirit and the passion and the things that people put it together to make them possible, to remind, to last. But sometimes what happens with most of these experiences is that they just, the person that is behind it die, or simply decided to go somewhere else, have family, stop doing art, and sometimes they don't continue. So for me, the moment in which the experience happened is the key. That's why I don't focus too much in what happened later. I'm not interested. This is for social scientists. How many, I'm not interested in that. I should perhaps, but I'm not interested in that. I'm more interested in what happened when the action is taking place. How that leave a trace in the city or in that community. Can I change the life of one individual? This little kid that was, for us, following us 3 days while we were doing the project somewhere in Douala. No? Will that experience change his life? Will bring something, different to his education or what he wants to do when he grows up? I don't know. But this, for me, it's more important than, that he actually is the one running the space after 10 years. I don't know if it makes sense. But.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think, any more questions at all? No? Okay, well, thank you very much, Elvira and TJ. It was really interesting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.